And so somebody might want to just put their on mute. Yeah, here with the usual meeting. These are some of the life skills we've learned, I think, since 2019. Most common phrases we keep on hearing from each other, of course, is, you're on mute or you're not on mute. So new life skills that we've been learning. As I was saying, I'm very glad to join you here today on the back of the really great work that's been driven here, and maybe to look at where it fits in terms of how we look together at shared data foundations and where this work fits with many other pieces of work across the sector. Quick introduction to Agritech NZ for those of you that aren't aware. We're an industry-based organisation, so we're membership-driven. We have over 150, about 162 member organisations that effectively make up the active part of the ecosystem, the Agritech ecosystem here in New Zealand. That includes trading Agritech businesses, be they large or small, investor groups, the university CRIs and research groups that are feeding into that ecosystem, the investors that are contributing to that ecosystem, and all of those different connections that really make this a sector that can work and collaborate and do work together. Our role is to connect, promote, and advocate on behalf of the sector, and we work with our members to do that. We formed 7 global partnerships with other groups overseas to help position ourselves to learn from them and to bring to them the best of what New Zealand Agritech has to offer. And we were a foundational part of the Agritech Industry Transformation Plan, the national sector strategy that's underway in its current form now. So that's a background. If you're not an Agritech NZ member, would love to speak to you, of course. A lot of the context when we talk about advocating on behalf of the sector, and this is work that we do, we're part of the NZ Tech Alliance. And so a lot of what we do is make sure that there really is tech thinking in the right place, because we see a lot of policy work going on where tech is often lacking. Probably very pertinently for today is this final piece, the Farm Environmental Plan pieces of work that we've been doing, and very on point for what's being done in terms of geospatial boundaries and those definitions, and to really enable farm environmental plans to be widely shared and widely used. We understand that there are different drivers or priorities in terms of how these things are delivered. It's some of this shared work that really puts the digital tools that are going to drive these future foundations for the sector in the right place. So that's a big part of the context here. But of course, there's lots of other pieces to this digital puzzle, both across our sector and in other parts of the ecosystem here in New Zealand. So we have many different industry transformation plans where there are similar conversations going around what does data-driven innovation really look like? What is the role for identity and data governance? What are some of the other standards that need to be worked on to make all of these pieces come together? And so with our members and with our partners and NZ Tech, we're really driving for with our agency partners, looking at how these things come together in terms of a national data strategy. And so the work that you're doing here today very much fits into that overall piece for the sector, but also the overall piece for the overall nation. When I look at what those shared data foundations work in the context that we've come to this, and that we try and help make some of the links and promotions, we have a merger of two acronyms: Integrated Farm Planning Steering Group and the Industry Transformation Plan, IFP and ITP. And the meeting point for those is looking at the role of or the issues that there are around data interoperability, and what are some of the human interoperability things that can be addressed. And so this project has very much come from that. Andrew and the team have taken some of the use cases that have come out, some of the issues that have been identified, and that's the real origin story, I guess, of this work on the back of other works around industry standards. Of course, there are many other pan-sector data collaborations going on, and we're an active supporter of these in terms of where they fit and what they're trying to achieve. So in particular, when we start speaking about geospatial boundaries, they're used in digital farm environmental plans. We're a big champion and supporter of the work that the Trust Alliance are doing in that space. And I know Clary has joined here today and is likely to be driving some of the first uses of the work that is under discussion and used here today. And the I4 community is working in the digital ITP and doing work around what data-driven innovation looks like, and really what are some of the collaborative skills and focus around that. And so I think what Andrew and the team here is showing some collaboration and action, and there are other people in other sectors looking at some of those same skills and those same approaches, learning from what's done here, but also adding to it. Vitally to all of this, of course, is other global links. Kenneth Irons, who's joined us on the session here today as well, in partnership with Andrew, is forging New Zealand relationships with the Smart Farms Working Group as part of the ISO, as well as regular catch-ups with Gateway and DDF. So lots of different connections that need to come to make all of these things real. So I guess that's some of the wider context. Many of you will be very aware of significant elements of these and be actively involved in them. I guess I wish you really well today in terms of this rubber meeting the road and knowing exactly where those geospatial boundaries are for that road, because it's the type of work that's shared today that'll really build those foundations for key things like our digital farm environmental plans and what's coming up. So good luck today. Well done, Andrew and the team, on the work so far. And I know that this this next piece of work will be exceedingly valuable.
Thank you very much, Brendan. That was awesome. Now I'd like to introduce Andrew, who's the main man for today. And again, he doesn't need much introduction either. So Andrew, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Brendan. And really excited to be not quite in the same room with you, but as close as we can get right at the moment. And look, I have to say, as I've watched people kind of connecting in, I'm going, oh yeah, I know. Oh yeah, I know them. Oh, great that they're here. So excellent to see you. And I don't know about you, but I really enjoy when we get to sort of physical events like the Agritech New Zealand meetings, like Digital Ag and Evoke Ag. It's the real opportunity to converse with you and network with you. And so seeing your names on the list here is a great reminder. And I know so many of you. If we haven't spoken and you're thinking, well, who is this guy? Please just use the you'll see my email later on. Drop me a note, and I'd be keen to catch up with you and to get to know you, because I think that's a big part of what we do in these sorts of activities. Liz has already shown you briefly the agenda, but I'm going to pick up on the why, and I think the fact that there's about 80 of us in the meeting today and another 40 who signed up and haven't made it here yet, and obviously hoping to watch online later on. Hi to all of you. This is obviously something that has turned on a level of interest for many of you. We're going to talk about the work that's been done previously, particularly last year, but some of the foundations of that, and then we're going to talk about the proposed work. And obviously, part of the thinking behind this is to get your input and to get your commitment's not quite the right word, but to encourage you to be involved in the process going forward. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So why do we need to collaborate? Why are we all sitting on this call or meeting? Well, I guess in short, there is a real driver and demand on our industry to make better and more effective use of data. There's increasing pressure on farmers and growers, and there's also increasing pressure on supply chains, right from kind of inputs and land supplies right through the spectrum and out to supply chains that move into retail and food service and fibre and other products in various forms, right? There's usage, there's a demand for information and insights and provenance and all those sorts of things. There's expectation that we'll be making greater usage of technology solutions to do that, despite as those acts that in process that Brendan showed that, you know, have no mention of anything technology related in them. It's sometimes implied between the lines. We know that complex data, like we see in our farming systems, is expensive to collect, and it's especially true if you collect it multiple times. And it's especially true if it's farmers' time and the time of well-paid advisors and consultants and other people who are spending time gathering data. There's a lot of applications out there, a lot of great ag tech applications out there, and that's fantastic. And they are like many of them solve fantastic vertical problems, but it's increasingly hard to stay within a single application silo. We tend to have to make things work with the wide spread of applications and tools that are used both on farm and through the supply chain. And there are specific drivers around spatial data, and some of those include things that have already been mentioned. Farm planning of various sorts, environmental and sustainability expectations, all of those sorts of things have a spatial component. So some specifics there. In our work last year, and I'll talk more about it shortly, we've been developing shared specifications. It's really important. We have not been developing standards, right? Those of us who've been working on this in collaboration, we're not a standards body. There are many standards bodies, and I'm sitting there seeing Peter Stevens signed in. I don't think I put GS1 on this list, but absolutely it belongs on that list, Peter, and probably right up in that top category. There's a number of kind of recognised global standards bodies that are the ones that we kind of look to set standards, and it's also the ones that governments and regulatory bodies look to say, well, there's the standard in place so we can use it, right? It's either a global standard or it's an aligned national standard that typically aligns with the global standard, and that's great. There's also a lot of industry task forces that have standards track protocols, and the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, will be a classic. Anyone can submit an RFC, a request for comment, you know, a proposed standard, but only very few are accepted onto their standards track protocols, right? And those ones we all know about because they become the things that drive the internet and all the tools we use. Then there are, let's call them non-standards track RFCs, and a wide range of other protocols and specifications. A lot of things that are commonly used across the technology sector fall into this category, and definitely industry standards, small s, often fit into those categories as well. So things like the group that I'm involved with, the International Committee for Animal Recording, that certainly does do work in the standard space, but their work on animal data exchange or livestock data exchange is definitely not a standards track protocol, right? It's down in this kind of other protocol specifications or shared specifications. And then at the bottom of my pyramid, and I know I've gone grossly simplified, is what I would call application-specific contracts. And you see those a lot. You see people, and we've done it as well. You create some software, you create some APIs, you document those APIs. There's now a contract with the callers of those APIs. Fantastic. It's not a standard either, right? And if you're a developer developing to those APIs, and if you only have to talk to one of them, it's fantastic. If you have to support two and they're not the same, it's clumsy. If you have to support 4 or 5, it starts to become a nightmare that drives you crazy. And that's why we say, let's for things that we are likely to encounter, multiple organizations, multiple tools trying to do similar but not quite the same things, let's try and see whether we can come up with some ways to document and have open or shared specifications that people can use, right? Some of those eventually get picked up by industry organisations and might eventually get put into standards track. And that's certainly happened in the world of the Open Geospatial Consortium, where a lot of pre-work that has been done by some of the country-specific groups has been picked up into new protocols in the Geospatial Consortium space. So I think one of the other great things about open specifications is that they help us scale. They help us get out of just writing lots and lots of different application-specific contracts, but they don't have the perceived slowness of full-featured standards track protocols, right? So something onto standards track typically means that the work, so a substantial body of work has been done before it's submitted to an industry body. Typically then goes through a task force or a working group and eventually comes out for consultation and eventually is adopted, right? So that can be perceived to be a slow process, whereas the open specifications process tends to be a bit more like open source, right? There still may be a cadence of releases and there's typically reviewers, but they tend to be more flexible and certainly we see this in some of the open source specifications. Great, so I'm going to switch across and just talk about the work that we have done to date. This work started with a meeting quite similar to this that Brendan hosted and I spoke in probably May last year. And then we formed a working group who worked through June and July last year on some open specifications. And that was a great group, and I see many of you are here on this call, and a big shout out, you guys did fantastic work. And really, I thought it was really good that we had a group from people who I would call technologists and know what their developers are talking about in terms of code, right through to people who know the broad areas that they're talking about and the farming or industry specific problems that they're trying to solve and are not data specialists. And in between we had some people who are working very much in that data space as well. And that made a very rich group that worked together well. We tried to do this as a MVP, minimum viable product, and we said, let's see whether we can collaborate and release a first version of a specification that picks up some of the common types of data that we see in a spatial data for a farming system. That's quite a defined scope. And we're going to pick a few of those and look at how we might share that data, how we might transmit it, if you like, and what might be the attributes of that data that gets shared. Because we all know that we can share shape files. We've been able to do that for 20 years. We all know that we can share a range of Open Geospatial Consortium APIs, both the older SOAP APIs and the newer JSON APIs. But how do you share and have a common set of attributes so that if you're talking about something, you can identify what it is you're talking about and what those attributes are? So that's the problem that we sought to solve. We decided we wouldn't reinvent the wheel and define things from scratch. So we based our work on GeoJSON and we based our work on the Open Geospatial Consortium APIs. That's the new modern APIs that effectively use GeoJSON. And we focused on defining some resource types, and you'll see those on the left there, and some attribute payloads for those resource types. And in particular, we said, actually, cadastral parcels, land units, land titles, and properties, rating units, are already well covered, at least in New Zealand, and I think in Australia too, by government organisations who've already done an excellent job of defining those. So we didn't set out to redefine those. We left those and said, those layers or areas, resource types are out of scope. We're going to focus on these ones up the top. And you might see that we called them quite specific names. We called them sites and holdings and plots. And that, again, is very deliberate because that's taken exactly from the inspired geospatial schemas that are used to catalogue and publish data in the EU, right? So wherever we can, reuse, 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 align with international standards, right? So APIs, OGC, GeoJSON data payloads for the actual data specification, JSON for your and JSON schema for your other attributes, and using Inspire resource type names. And so a holding is the operating farm, a site is the land management units, and For those of you working in New Zealand and working to try and deal with, some of the freshwater requirements, you'll have heard talk about land that is effectively joined together. And if it's just a road in between, that's fine. But if there's another property in between, that's a separate site, right? And so that's how you can use sites. And plots are a representation of paddocks, blocks, crops, depending on your type of farming, but they're all the same thing effectively. So that's the work that was done by that group, and they looked at other things, a range of attributes of those. And so there's methods for doing categorization. So if you want to say, hey, this is the slope class or the soil class or the land use class, there's mechanisms for doing that. If you want to say here is the crop that's being grown on that, there's mechanisms for doing that, right? So there's some of that sort of stuff. That's the work to date. And there is a lovely diagram that I'm not going to spend any time on, but gives you an idea of some of the complexity and some of the problems that the team worked on solving. Right, so it's all very well and good to list these things, but you actually have to say, well, what are the things that go into these, and where's the metadata that lets you see how it's described, and all of those sorts of bits and pieces. If you're interested in getting a copy of that, afterwards we can share with you the URL to the GitHub website where all of this stuff is stored. And that's probably the other key thing. We collaborated making use of GitHub, which is used for a lot of open source projects. It's also used for a lot of IETF type standards development projects, where people actually need to say, great, I've got an idea. I'm going to first raise it as an issue. We're going to have a big discussion about it. And then I'm going to write down how technically it might look. And I'm going to propose that as what's called a pull request, which is a request saying, please pull this into the project. And the people who maintain the project will review that, have some more discussions, maybe come back with you and suggest some changes, and then eventually merge that pull request into the project. I think I've worked on a number of projects now, and it's an incredibly open but also productive way of working. Cool. Let's talk about what might come up. So we finished that work, and we kind of wrote our report to MPI and Agritech New Zealand, who organised and funded this work late last year. And we said there is demand from our group of participants to do some more. Right? They were keen to keep meeting, and many of them had other things on their list that they wanted to cover off. In particular, wetlands. What are the attributes of wetlands? Riparian zones, areas that you might have fenced off, biodiversity areas, forests, farm forests. How do you kind of record the attributes of those? Others in our group wanted to pick up on what I would call land-based observations or activities. So things like spray plans and maybe fertilizer plans and spray and fertilizer applications. And you're getting very much into the space that I would say there is already partly covered by Ag Gateway. Ag Gateway has a number of work that they've done over time. Huge proportion of their work has been on what I would call the supply chain to farm and the supply chain from farm. So the movement of goods, products in and out of the farm. But some work has been done on farm activities, and ADAPT picks those up really well. However, ADAPT is a data model. It has a wide variety of representations. And there is also an open source tool for converting between representations, which is fantastic. Doesn't necessarily cover all of the activities that we might see in Australia or New Zealand. So one of the possibilities is to do some work there that aligns what we're already doing, that is very much OGC API based, and it links it in with Ag Gateway's ADAPT. And I think that would be a fantastic contribution to a number of communities. And again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. There are people in New Zealand and Australia who are already doing this work. So what we don't want is for you to have to throw out everything you've done over the last 10 years because, hey, there's a new pseudo standard, right? That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to learn from and make best use of what you've already done if you're willing to share it and to incorporate it. And that might be what you use when you're building the next version of your interface or application, right? These things are not overnight. So that's what we're planning to do. And I'm going to pause there. And Liz, I think you're still online. What we're going to do is we're going to do some questions later on, which are the very, let's save our big and gnarly questions for later on. But I'm keen now to take some questions if something I've said is confusing, or if this idea of the scope of what we'd like to do in the next piece of work, you've got some thoughts or questions about, either pop them in the chat and Liz will call them out, or use the little reactions thing to raise your hand, like this. Don't know if you can see my little hand raising there. And again, Liz or I will just say, please unmute yourself and call out with any questions. And it's worth saying we were going to break into discussion groups when I thought we would have about 30 or 40 people. And then the numbers ticked upwards and upwards, and we thought at 80 people plus it's going to be hard to have discussion groups. So any clarifications or questions? No? Nice and simple. Okay, I must have communicated all right. Other than that, I've completely lost you. Oh, Phil.
I've got one, yep.
G'day, Andrew. Thanks for thanks. It's fantastic. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, look, really sort of glad to see this work going on. It's great. Just a sort of question, the model of holding sites and plots. I've tried to explain that to a few Australian producers, and I have struggled when we have farms and paddocks and fields and zones. So nomenclature is actually important here, and 100 years of history as well, or 200 years of history of what people call things. So I suppose we've got a data model, which I've sort of discussed briefly with you before, that we've developed within an Esri system, but that doesn't matter, basically, which has the concept of paddocks, fields, zones, etc., and crop types and land use and land management through time as well. So there's effectively probably another couple of other layers in there.
Yep.
But I suppose in terms of that nomenclature of plots and sites being unique to inspire in a European sort of view of the world and what they call things, can you see some flexibility to have a common structure but maybe call things something a little bit different?
Yeah, great question. I guess what I would say is when you're defining a specification, or in this case a data model, I think it's fine to call it what you like, right? You've probably all seen data models that have got a something or underscore something or other in the name. We would definitely not reflect that sort of language out into the user interface for our end user community, right? So it might be called a plot in here, but if you're writing something for livestock farmers, you are certainly going to call it a paddock. Does that make sense? So now, I personally believe that as we move on with this work, we will come up with additional entities like zones, right? So that, it really makes sense. I've used them in other applications, I think in the same sense in which you mean them, Phil. Yeah. We've also, I think, already catered for in the metadata for things having a lifetime, and I think I could definitely see people creating more entities that build off this, that allow much more kind of lifetime management as well. Yeah. So this is very much just the core, and I think you kind of have to say we're going to have a common nomenclature, but we may not always reveal that out to people. And to be fair, if I was talking to a farmer even in the EU and they were in Germany or France, they wouldn't call things a holding or a plot because they'd be speaking in French or in German, right? So you put it into whatever it needs to be in your local. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Great, and there's another question in the chat there, Andrew, from Nathan.
Brilliant. G'day, Nathan. Good to have you here. Right. Excellent question. Is there any relationship between these new resource types, like those holdings and so forth, and parcels or properties, or are they completely decoupled? I'm going to zoom backwards, if I can, to a slide there. I don't know if you can see this. It's actually stolen with permission from Sam Ragnarsson, who was at Environment Canterbury when he drew this up. And the concept here is of multiple spatial concepts or layers, which are effectively independent. So let's just pretend that cadastral parcels was one of the bottom ones down here. Effectively, they may overlay each other and they may share boundaries, but we haven't attempted to link them. In practice, you're likely to define your operating farm, your holding, by saying, well, it's these parcels plus the bit of the neighbour's property that I lease without a registered parcel thing, plus a bit of the easement or the paper road, which I also use, right? And so that's why the holding boundary or the operating farm boundary is different from the parcels, but absolutely conceptually they're linked. We haven't tried to actually link them from a data perspective. Great question though, Nathan. And you could, couldn't you? You could see how you could actually link those collections. Cool.
No other questions.
Cool. We've got a couple of polls, and these polls are they're way not definitive, right? They're opportunities for you to kind of share some thoughts and feedback with us, and it's very early because some of you may be only hearing this for the first time. So in that case, you know, do your best to answer it to the best of your knowledge, and I think that will be fine. So the first poll is going to be looking at areas of interest, and this again is basically getting some feedback on what our smaller group told us interested them, and we're really keen to get your feedback on that. So do you want to turn that poll on, Liz?
Andrew, I think you're going to have to do it from your end. Sorry, they're not coming up for me.
Okay, we'll wait while they appear on my screen.
Apologies.
No, all good. Right, here we go. I'm clicking launch now. Let's see what happens. Should pop up on your screen with some tick boxes that you can enter results into. If you're not seeing the poll, just shout out. Anyone, can you see the poll? Yep, cool.
No.
No? No, that's a bit tricky.
It's just come up over the top of your presentation.
But maybe not for everybody from the sounds of it.
No.
Good old teams.
It also comes up in the
you can't see it because it's if it's on the right hand side, you can't see all the writing, so it's hard to actually see what you're voting for.
Ha! That's probably a deliberate trick. No, it's not.
If you scroll down, if you're on a phone, where the answers are, you can kind of get a little bit of a better view of the full question, if that helps.
Yeah, it's also in the chat. So if you're able to switch over and view the chat, you can often see the poll in the chat. So I'm seeing categories like how people and organisations are identified, sitting on about 8%. How permissions for data are represented, sitting on about 10%. Farm scale, spatial features and their attributes, about 30%. Community or catchment scale features and their attributes, about 12%. Observations and activities undertaken on land areas, about 25%. Risks, mitigations and plans about 11%, something else not specified about 2%. Cool.
Yeah, and the results coming up in the chat too, so that's great.
That's great. So let's move on and do the second poll, and hopefully you'll be able to read some of the text. This is where the previous one was multiple choice. This one's a single choice, and this one's a bit more challenging. How will your organisation participate? And again, I know it's way too early to actually make a commitment, but I'm always curious and keen to get a bit of your feedback. So I'm going to launch this poll and see if we can get your feedback. And again, it should come up either on screen or in the chat, or adjust or rotate your mobile device as you need to. The options here are: how will your organisation participate? A, we're keen to build something. B, we expect to have someone involved in the process. C, I personally, rather than my organisation, would like to be involved. D, we can't be involved now, but we'll watch and stay updated. And E, this is not for us. Cool, some results coming through. Hey, that's really encouraging. Got about 20% of people are keen to build something. That'd be cool. About just over 50% are keen to have somebody involved in the process, and about 20% are going to watch and stay updated, which is great. Excellent. So bear with me, and when it comes back up, I'll close the poll. Hopefully you can see the results there in the chat. Brilliant. So that's really encouraging. Obviously, we're kind of only partway through the time, so there's more content to come, I'm afraid. I want to also run something past you, which is, again, we've been discussing with a group of organisations, a small group of organisations, something that we'd like to do. And again, I thought it's always worth telling people about this because there's probably more who would like to be involved, right? This is not really a standard specifications process, although I'm sure what we learn will go back into it. There's a group of us who've been talking about actually implementing some farm boundary or farm map type data interchanges. And that's probably as you would expect. You'd expect us to want to do that. And we want to use the shared specifications that we've developed to implement those specifications. But we're also seeing that it's a bit of a learning process. And as I've talked with people who are keen to be involved in this process, there's a few extra things, you know, exactly how will we create these API protocols? What are we going to do about permissions or authentication between them? What about data quality or provenance? Is this map good enough for this purpose? Was it hand drawn or was it digitized some way by going out with a GPS unit? Now, was it hand drawn by somebody who's, you know, maybe, I don't know, the farmer or a consultant who popped out or somebody who's a specialist mapping company? You know, there's a wide range of potential accuracy, and probably all of them are really useful to share, but you might use them for different purposes if you were trying to use something for, I don't know, a regulatory purpose or a precision purpose where you actually had to schedule a drone or a planting robot or something to do something, right? And what about updates between systems? So if I've got a software application and I actually take the map from another software application as input so the farmer doesn't have to redraw the map in my application, what if they make updates in that other application? Do I want to get a feed of those updates? If I do, is it real time, or do I just request and get changes since I last requested? Could updates be two-way? There's some interesting conversations to be had there. And you can have these theoretical conversations, and that's great, but conversations get really specific and practical when you're trying to implement something. So we've been building for a while some infrastructure to allow us to do this sort of API connection. And we've been talking to some people who are keen to do it themselves as well. And so there's a small group of us who are likely to want to collaborate on this stage. And obviously anything we learn about, well, what do we do from a data perspective about identifying data quality, we would expect to feed back into that group working on the shared specifications. I'm not going to do a poll on this one, but what I would say is if this sounds interesting to you, take the opportunity during this meeting to ask some more questions, and we're going to go into a time for some questions and some feedback now, and then I'll put my contact details up on the screen shortly, and Liz's, and please get in touch with Liz or I if you'd like to be involved, or if you have further questions or comments, or if you'd like a call and we can talk about it further. Hopefully that makes sense. Cool. So we're going to dive into questions, and I'm expecting and hoping that there'll be plenty of questions. Like I say, I was going to do breakout groups, and I thought, no, let's actually, while we've got such a big group, we'll make use of the chat and we'll make use of the hand up symbol, and really keen to get a bit of a conversation going. Some questions. Don't be afraid to feed back on somebody else's question like Phil did earlier on in the chat. That was fantastic. I see Shane's got his hand up. Excellent to see you, Shane.
No, yeah, sorry I was late. Okay, well, just regarding that last slide, which is really interesting and important about sharing data, I guess my question is more of a observation of complexity. So if I'm thinking of a parcel of land, I'm going to call it a block because it's a vineyard, and within that I've got some other geospatial attribute. Well, I've got rows basically, and within those rows I've got some data points for every vine in the row. And if I was, and I've got information I've collected on every data point. Well, I've collected on those data points. I might have data points for sensors as well. And if I was just to receive an update from someone else, it might disturb my understanding of the number of plants in the row and all the data points and where they get connected to.
Absolutely.
So it's obviously if I'm the owner of the block of land, and I'm the owner of the rows and the points, then I'm authoritative, and I'd never expect to ingest data which is going to override what I've got. If I'm sharing data, that data most likely wouldn't be at plant. Well, it might be if I'm sharing it to someone who's going to do analysis for me at level of individual plant. You know, I can imagine data points about the, relating to the vines and the, when they were planted. I can't remember the name of that word for that stuff about individual vines. That, what do you call that thing? But anyway, that direction is going to be really important.
Yep.
And who owns the definition and what things you might willingly absorb and be happy to update, and what for example, data that a third party has provided based on the soil, the EM numbers, or which are probably not vine specific, but they relate to an area, so that's the complexity, isn't it?
that is a brilliant question, Shane, and you've raised a whole load of really interesting points. So you've talked about some other data types that we don't yet have in the spec, but Ollie Madgett is here on the call, and through Collaboraculture, they've been doing quite a lot of work about defining some of those other attributes like rows and plants and wires and things like that. So that's interesting. But I think you're right. I think we need to think. Yep, brilliant. He's popped it in the chat. We absolutely need to think about what is authoritative and what authoritative means in the new world where data might come from multiple sources, right? So to me, it makes sense for a producer, a grower or a farmer to kind of say this software package or this tool or this database is authoritative for this type of data on my farm at the moment. And then, but that source over there, that's authoritative for some other type of data, and that's really tricky for us to get our heads around. So brilliant question, Shane.
Yeah.
Going to take a bit to unpack that.
Yeah, but I'm keen to that's a discussion I'm keen to participate on.
Yeah, I like that. That would be a really useful thing to work through. Anyone else?
There's a question in there from Hazel. Thoughts on digital twin technology for smart farms?
Another good question. A good question. And there's always this question of, at what level do you say this is a digital twin? And let me explain what I mean by that. Digital twins are typically used for predictive decision making of some sort. If we do this or apply this or whatever else, then that will happen or might happen, some probability of it happening. And so people create digital twins to allow you to model or look at options, all of those sorts of things. And what's the level of granularity for that digital twin? So some of them are going to need to be highly granular, but actually we've used conceptual digital twins for a long time, particularly in the agricultural industry. There've been crop models where you put in half a dozen parameters about a crop for a long time. But I think when we talk about digital twins now, we're tending to go, actually, they need a lot more detail than that. And so they need all the things that Phil and Shane have just talked about potentially, right? So we need our paddocks and our blocks and our previous crops and our soil attributes and other things, but we actually also need to know stuff about history and stuff about other detailed attributes depending on your model. Yeah. Good question. Did I see another hand up somewhere?
Not that I can see.
Oh yeah, Ollie's got his hand up. There we go. Good time.
Oh.
Hello, Andrew. Oh, it's fantastic to see you pushing forwards with this. It's actually maybe a question back for you, and thank you for mentioning, we've made a start with looking at mapping and creating specifications around creating maps of vineyards. So, and again, we've just made an initial start here, and I'm really looking at whether, what we found is we've made a start, and then we are trying to work out how to maintain the momentum, and we've gone quiet for a little bit, and I'm kind of hoping that we could potentially use this as our next, working with you guys, use this as our next burst of momentum. So I think we're super open. We did get the Wine Australia folks to speak to the Wine New Zealand folks, so they've talked and shared, and then we have some really big common wine producers like Pernod Ricard that obviously span both countries really significantly. So it's almost, we're going to try and, I'll try and think about suggestions from my side of how we can leverage this, but also really open for anybody on the call, or yourself, Andrew, or any of your team, just to say, the ideal way for the wine industry to engage with this next phase of the work you're doing across both Australia and New Zealand is to do this. It's do we create a little, do we, I don't know. I'm just sort of flagging up that we're super open to being led we'll do our best to put ideas forwards, and we've made a start, and we've got some shared understanding, and but we've just made a start.
Yeah, and again, I'm really impressed with what the Collaboraculture group have done, and the thinking that's gone behind that as well. So I think it would be fantastic to have some of that engagement. And obviously what we don't want to do is either within countries or within industries is kind of do a reinvent of the wheel and reinvent the same things, right? We want to kind of build on what each other are doing. The way I look at it, and there's some great comments in the chat from Sarah and from Phil about national data sets as well. And I think there's opportunity for national data sets and for industry data sets. A lot of the work you did in the first pages of Collaboraculture, Ollie, was about defining a schema, but the point of defining the schema was so that you had some data sets that you could start to build off, right? We're kind of picking up on the schema development stuff, and I'd love to see those projects put together, and that gives us a great schema. But I think there's still the opportunity to then say, great, but actually schemas are only a piece of the puzzle, right? We do need some of those other data sets. We'd love to have LiDAR data more available, but also probably some interpolated or interpreted layers built on that. Phil is exactly right about the Waterway data sets. We, in theory, have an authoritative national Waterway data set, right? But it's probably a bit dated, and it's certainly not, as far as I know, regularly up to date from more modern survey data. But maybe it is. Wouldn't it be great to get some of those data flowing through? So I guess, Ollie, I would love to see some alignment. There's plenty of people here. Shane would be among them, who are very much involved in the wine industry. And I think, if there was a group who was keen to, again, pick this up from both a contribution to the specification, but also doing some implementation together and learning from it, that's always really good.
I was just going to say, sorry, really, yeah, just we've got, we'll see whether it all comes together, but we've put in an application to get a little bit more support for one of our wine. You basically prove everything out in one wine region in Australia. So we'd, if that can be helpful, that will actually be some additional resources we have to kind of actually enable all vineyards in a wine region to have an authoritative map created for them that fits the specification, and some support to actually support some Agritech companies to maybe sense data, do some kind of work around creating data that appends to the right row or the right vine or the right block. And so, yeah, if that comes off in the next few weeks, that's going to be actually some resources that we can put to this, which is, yeah, obviously one of our missing pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be brilliant. Wow, there's some good stuff in the chat. Sarah and Phil, so I completely agree with your comments around some good national data sets. That's absolutely something that we need to be picking up with and there's some of them on this call or who are going to follow up and watch it later, our government organisations and related organisations who could help with that. Nathan, do you want to talk to the ISO 19115 topics theme?
Sure. So I'm just intrigued that you have gone for the Inspire themes, which I do actually, probably out of all of the different standards families that you could use, I actually like Inspire the best. So that's kind of part of where my question is coming from. But there are standards which are relatively similar, such as the UN GGIM themes and the ISO 19115 topics. So I'm just interested in the process that you went through to decide to use Inspire. And part of my question relates to other areas where it's always a struggle when there's multiple standards and you get somebody who decides to align all of the standards, and all of a sudden you've got a new standard. Just what was the thinking behind Inspire, and if, for example, this data is going to be used in conjunction with other data sets, then should we all be using Inspire for a lot of things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll admit we did a bit of searching initially, and this is probably a while back that we started looking at this, probably pre the working group last year. And I was doing some work with some groups in the EU, so that's where I became aware of Inspire. And so some of the data sets that we were trying to represent were already aligned with the Inspire themes. And I looked through them, and I also liked them. I thought, there's a few gaps, but really it's really very thorough and quite helpful. I didn't really know about the depths of the ISO 19115 until Kenneth got me involved in some of these ISO standards smart farming discussion groups, and so I'm kind of learning that there's a bunch of ISO stuff as well that we could perhaps also be aligning with. I don't have an opinion on where you should use one rather than the other, but I'm keen to get feedback and discover more.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Excellent. Sarah, your suggestion around drone use in ag, I probably don't have a lot that I can immediately answer, but I think, again, if we were thinking about putting together some groups to work on this stuff, there are other people who I can see in this meeting who either are or have worked with drone data. And there are some I know who are working with multispectral and satellite imagery. And it would be great to, as we get some of these discussion groups going, for you to find each other and start that conversation. Yeah, we've been trying to figure out how we're using multispectral imagery in some of our projects, and we've been trying to figure out, well, how might you interchange that when you need to in an open way? Good question. Renee, you've got an interesting question there. Don't know whether you want to speak to that one about animal health and welfare.
Hi everyone, thanks Andrew. And I guess it was just a thought, Andrew, and while I was just waiting to sort of discuss it, I was just thinking about the hort industry as well. So pest and disease, both like animal and plant, I guess.
Yes.
But just looking at any opportunity to add that data into the data set for the particular farm business and also for national data trends.
Yeah, that's another really interesting one, isn't it? It's the interaction between, let's call it farm or land management scale layers, so farm and maybe up towards the community, where there are things that we're capturing and often exchanging between software systems, and we get, this is where a lot of our discussion around data interoperability sits, but there are also national data sets on a range of scales. And so we know about soils data in New Zealand and internationally, and that's a classic international data set. But its updating is relatively slow, right? Because it's not like we suddenly get new insights week to week in soils. But when you're dealing with the climate data, that might give you microclimate zones for your animal health and welfare or disease and pest stuff, that's updated much more frequently. And it's like some of that satellite data where, you might be getting passes every few days. There are people doing some work in that space. A lot of the weather services have been doing work. A lot of it's research oriented, which means it tends to be really big data sets, large scale, and not really designed for, sending little updates, chatty updates between the sort of software systems that many of us are involved in at farm scale. It'd be another really interesting area of work.
Thanks, Andrew.
Phil, do you want to jump in around the Waterway stuff, and maybe Steve can add to it once you've spoken?
Yeah, briefly, if you like. It's always been a little bit of a pet one of mine that our fundamental data set for the nation is based on a 1 to 50,000 topo map primarily, and it's not very spatially accurate. If you're thinking about precision agriculture and doing exclusion zones and various other catchment studies and things like that, you really do want to have a pretty accurate data set. And I think there's fantastic opportunity, whether it's LINs that take it up or not, to create a data set from this new LiDAR piece of work. And obviously Steve will talk about that, I'm guessing, but that's going on in the country at the moment. It gives us some pretty good opportunities to get something pretty nice out of it. And one other small thing, which may be a challenge out to people that can do this sort of thing, but I see another byproduct of the LiDAR maybe looking at a hybrid satellite / fixed wing imagery data set for the country, where you could do some sort of what should we call it, transformation of the satellite data using the first and second points of the LiDAR to maybe squeeze a relatively accurate satellite data set in, so that you can use that as well for some of your varying features you might want to do in any sort of agriculture, because we know it's more timely than fixed wing and how long it takes to process it. However, of course, we know how inaccurate, because of it being primarily fairly oblique, it's not the most accurate thing for doing fence lines and waterways and areas of vegetation and things like that. But I think there's a real opportunity there for someone that's good with machine learning and AI to maybe take a challenge like that. We have, for instance, your first returns, building roofs, silos, things like that. If you know where that is with your LiDAR and you can squeeze it with a bit of machine learning with your satellite data, I think you get a pretty awesome national data set out of that as well. So I just throw that in there as well.
Absolutely. And the increase in satellites might mean that New Zealand gets some that are a little bit less oblique in time.
Yep, Steve here, Steve Critchlow. I just had a little bit of experience with Northland Regional Council, because we bid on a project there to build a really detailed waterways network from their LiDAR. And this is, right from low points in paddocks through to the sea, and then classify them. And we weren't successful, but I can tell you, it's a remarkably cheap exercise for the Northland Regional Council, being done by an Australian firm. So
interesting.
Maybe you want to contact Northland Regional Council and find out how they're doing it.
Absolutely. That might be a good part of Phil's answer too. Although, obviously, yeah. Hopefully the quality is there as well.
Well, one would hope. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. David, I see your comment back to Nathan about Inspire, and yeah, absolutely. It's worth saying we haven't taken on Inspire's catalogues so much as their themes. Their organisation of data themes is very useful. I don't know that most of their catalogues seem to be primarily regional or national scale, which didn't help most of us working in the agricultural sector. Clary, you might want to comment, and Peter Stevens might want to follow on about the link to entities. I think that's quite interesting.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. From the amount of applications which we see, it would be fantastic to have a farm defined. Okay, that's maybe another work stream. But when we have then the legal entity, like an NZBN number defined, and can link to a paddock or farm boundaries with a GLN, the global location number, that would help a lot to enhance the data interoperability. And the NZBN is already a GLN number from the structure, so that would be a good step forward. If we can consider it in scope. Peter, if you want to add something, please feel free.
Yeah, so Peter Stevens here, GS1. Thank you, Clary and Andrew. So briefly, for those people that aren't aware, the New Zealand business number that the government runs for all businesses appears in two forms. One is it's the public register, with the environment that sits off that, but also off that it's been used to power things like the COVID poster locations. So there's almost 1 million locations that have been established, and the government's that system was co-opted for COVID, but actually was designed originally to power EDI and advanced shipping notifications, e-commerce. So in some ways we need to think about what the government is doing with that, which is the global location number structure.
Mm-hmm.
Also being adopted by couriers and the shipping and logistics companies so delivery points. If we think about how that triangulates back to on-farm activities, I think would be useful.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that the dairy industry right at the moment is having a discussion around are there new ways that we can use to identify dairy herd locations for the herd improvement scheme that don't rely on using at the moment the location ID, the map reference out of a 1960s paper map series. So it'd be great to get some happening.
Yeah, and traceability and all that sort of stuff. I think certainly we're working with the farm merchants around standardised attributes, but of course that's starting from a different way, identification leading to delivery and supply chain focus. Whereas of course some of the stuff obviously is that you're talking about is approaching it from a different direction.
There is an argument for some, and I'm looking at Carl's comment about spatially enabling national ag production statistics. There is some opportunity, I would have thought, for use of NZBNs and spatial data to enable farmers to effectively reuse some of this information about location for a range of purposes. And it always interests me when I kind of have done work in New Zealand and Australia, and I compare it to work I've been doing with our sister business in the UK, where there is the RPA, the Rural Payments Agency, and of course they're highly motivated by the payments, but where producers can maintain a map of their holding, that is the spatial map that is tied to a centralised identifier, and they still control that, right? So they still get to say about where it's used, but they can say so that it's also available and then it's used in a range of other government and non-government related activities.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, not to drag it out further, but for those of you that haven't looked at the NZBN structure that the government has, I think the power of it for counterparty transactions is very important, because actually it not only has legal robustness, but also has penalties and sanctions for misuse. So in some use cases, it's an obvious one to identify who the party is that you're using, let alone the extension for locations.
So, Carl, I've obviously mentioned your comment, haven't given you an opportunity to ask more of a question on it. Do you want to jump in there and add anything else to that?
I think you've touched on it, but the problem we have is that we send out forms to businesses and we get a lot of data back, but we can't really map it, because the purpose of the ag production statistics is to create national statistics. So location doesn't really matter, but it's starting to matter now. And there's no way to link all of that rich vein of data that we collect to the area of land that it applies.
Yeah, and that would be really valuable. I know when I get my various statistics forms, and they've taken to emailing them to me because they never appear through New Zealand Post until after they're due. And I often think, gosh, wouldn't it be great to be able to kind of fill this in online and specify some of those IDs to pull in data? So yeah, good thought.
And the other problem is the use of street address to identify the location of the farm. If you're using the business address, we have a lot of what we call Queen Street farms.
Yes, yes. And I know friends of mine who are probably also online, who worked in Meat and Livestock Australia, told me about their property identification codes, and a lot of their addresses when they mapped them came down to post office boxes in the CBDs. So, yeah, same challenge.
Yes, although address for service deal ends up versus the address of the actual business, I think starts dealing with some of that issues, which is underway.
Yep, exactly. Great, excellent. There's some good comments and discussions. I'm just looking to see if there's anything additional that we'd like to pick up. David, you've made a couple of comments about Inspire. Did you want to kind of expand on that or share any of your other thoughts? We've unashamedly stolen from some of your previous work in what we've done last year around the geospatial specs. So,
not really. I mean, they obviously Inspire. A lot of people invested a lot of time working on those themes, and I mean a lot of time. So reusing them is a good idea. I mean, our experience of trying to use some of them, particularly in the soil space, was that they were quite difficult and didn't necessarily map on the way that others might think about soil as information. But it's a good source of knowledge around the efforts that one has to expend on doing this. And if you can reuse, then that's a good idea because it does save you a lot of stress and time.
Brilliant. Liz, I'm very aware that we had said we would wrap up at 3:14 and it's now 3:16.
Me.
Are there any other questions from people that you'd like us to hit? Otherwise, we will we'll sign off.
Yeah, I think we covered the bulk of the questions, but all the comments will be captured so we can go back through just to double check we haven't missed anything. And equally, if you think of something, you may as well just send it through to our addresses or follow up with us and we can get back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So those polls that we did earlier on about would you like to be involved with X, Y, or Z were anonymous. So you could say it, but you didn't actually have to make a commitment, which is great. From here, we're going to be dropping a note back to everyone who registered, which hopefully is most of you, unless somebody shared the link with you. If that's you, please let us know who you are so we can contact you as well. But we'll be sharing back to you. We'd like to, you'll have seen we recorded this session. There was a recording banner as you came in or just afterwards. We recorded this session. We would like to share back that recording once we've made sure we can do that. We would like to find out who's involved, who wants to get involved in the next piece of generating those shared specifications. And our plan is to do that over probably a 12-week period starting quite soon with one 1-hour meeting per fortnight, not even per week, right? So really lightweight on your time. And that spreads it out so people have got time to think about things and do some research into things and discuss with other members of their teams. So keen to get people involved in that. If you're keen to work on that kind of shared foundation and actually trying to figure out some of the gnarly bits that Shane and I were talking about interchanging data, again, drop us a note back and we'll include you in the discussion group for that as well. Thank you very much for your time and hopefully you found it interesting. And again, if you've seen somebody online who's made some really interesting comments or put something in the chat, please follow up with them. One of the big benefits of this work is we get a community of people who start collaborating together and discussing. And that's probably more useful than the written specifications, at least in the short term.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great stuff, guys.
Thank you.